On May 19, 1536 the sky wept a pale shade of grey. As dawn stretched across the tower cold, air clung to the wooden scaffold built. During the night it was not high like others but low and solemn built for something uncommon, a queen's execution. Not by the English axe but by the sword of a Frenchman. In the alleys outside the crowd stirred whispers ran like wind. Through grass a queen executed today. Some arrived in disbelief, others came with grim curiosity, but all felt something greater. This was history, unmaking itself inside the tower's stone walls. And Boleyn opened her eyes. Her prison for 17 days had become a shrine to memory and silence. She lay still. Today the world would forget her as a queen, but she would remember herself as one her ladies helped her dress. Few had remained, but they were faithful to the end. She chose her garments with care, a grey mantle fur-lined and a crimson bodice beneath, not to hide her fear but to hide the blood. She was elegance even in death, and touched her throat and smiled. I hear the executioner is very good, she said, a sparkle of irony in her voice. I have a little neck. The words were delicate, almost humorous, but the silence that followed was heavy. She was born to ambition and refinement, daughter of Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard, and had once been a girl at the French court, learning the language of power and seduction. She was never ordinary, not then, not now. Henry VIII saw her not as a mistress but as a challenge. When she denied him what her sister had given freely, he offered her more than desire. He offered her a crown, and with it destruction. To marry her Henry broke with Rome. He shattered the church, crowned himself its head, and set England ablaze with reform. It was not for love, it was for legacy. But when and gave him a daughter, not a son, his heart began to cool too. Miscarriages followed, one was a boy. Henry saw only failure and felt the cracks forming beneath her feet. Around her enemies watched, waiting, whispering. Her womb had become her enemy. Thomas Cromwell moved in shadows. He gathered lies and dressed them as truth. 5 men, adultery, treason, even her brother George. On May 2nd and was arrested. The Queen no longer walked in gold but in chains. The Tower did not welcome her. It consumed her. The same walls that once held her coronation feast now echoed with dread, and looked out the small window and saw nothing but grey sky and waiting silence. On May 15th they gave her a trial with no defense, no truth, no mercy. Her enemies sat in judgment. The charges absurd, her words measured, brilliant, but none of it mattered. The verdict had been chosen before she even stood. One witness wrote, she spoke not as a woman but an angel. Yet they called her adulteress, they called her traitor. Her crown once placed upon her with cheers now hovered like a curse above her. The sentence was death by fire, the fate of female traitors. But Henry, cold and strategic, commuted it to beheading, a gesture not of mercy but of control. He sent for a French executioner, fast, clean, efficient. On the day of her death, she was told at 8 o'clock. She prayed, steeled herself, but then word came the execution was delayed until noon. A cruel twist the hours stretched. Her faith held, but her heart ached. With each breath she took communion with trembling hands. Lord, have mercy on me, she whispered. Again and again her voice never cracked, but her soul pleaded. She swore on the host that she had never betrayed the king, and she meant it. She gave each of her ladies a final token, a handkerchief, a jewel, a prayer book. Remember me, and how I end, she said. The Tower courtyard was now filled with waiting souls, but the loudest sound was sorrow. She stood on the scaffold and looked out. No fear, no rage, only Dignity I come here to die according to the law, she said, I will accuse no man. I pray God save the king. Her words were like silk across broken stone. She removed her cap and mantle, knelt upright. There was no block for her head, just the stillness of breath and the blindfold of faith. The executioner stepped behind. Where is my sword? He asked aloud, a trick to ease her final moment, and turned her head slightly, drawn by the sound. The sword flashed one stroke. Silence, then a gasp from the crowd. The executioner held her head aloft. So perished the king's enemies, he cried, but the crowd gave no roar, only a murmur, only sorrow as Anne's blood touched the scaffold. A cannon fired from the tower. The sound rolled across the Thames like the voice of a god announcing change. Far away in Whitehall Henry heard it. He was free to wed again. The very next day Henry became engaged to Jane Seymour. 10 days later he was married. Anne's body was barely cold, her name barely whispered, but the throne already had a new queen. Time for Henry did not mourn. There was no coffin for and no funeral rite, no honor. The guards found an old arrow chest empty, crude in it they laid her body. Her head was placed beside her torso, a queen buried as if she were nothing more than broken tools. They carried her to the chapel of St. Peter at Vinca within the tower. There beneath the stone floor they dug a shallow grave. No tombstone, no name, just earth, cold and unfeeling. The silence sealed her fate. Henry ordered her portraits destroyed, her emblem, the white falcon, removed from walls and halls. Her name was struck from records. History was rewritten as if Anne had never worn the crown, never stirred the heart of a king. It was a damnio memorial, the condemnation of memory. Rome had used it to silence traitors. Henry used it to silence regret. If she was never remembered, perhaps she had never mattered. But silence does not last forever. The daughter and left behind Elizabeth was but a girl, seen as a disappointment, a girl born to a disgraced queen, but within her something burned, not just royal blood but resolve, not just legacy but fury. 23 years after Anne's death, Elizabeth ascended the throne. The daughter of the condemned became the virgin queen, ruler of an empire. Her reign stretched 45 years. And blood erased in shame now flowed in glory. In 1876, centuries later, restorers working in the chapel of St. Peter uncovered bones, delicate, feminine, the skull small, the frame slight. They believed it was, and she was rearied with dignity, at last given a place among the remembered. Each year on the anniversary of her death, roses are placed on the spot where she fell. A simple glass slab marks the site. It bears no crown, no title, only memory, and that at last is enough. In those 17 days locked within the tower, and wrote no final letters, left no confession. What she left behind were prayers, silence, and the haunting gaze of a woman who understood that her truth would not save her. Every servant who passed her, every guard who stood watch, did so with uneasy eyes. Some pied, some judged, all knew they were watching the fall of a queen, orchestrated like theater, scripted, rehearsed, tragic. And once loved Henry not only as a king but as a man who had dared to change the world for her. That love, once fire, had turned to ash. She had risked everything for him. He had offered her death before. And there was Mary Boleyn, the king's mistress, soft-spoken, forgettable. Anne refused to be another shadow. She had demanded a crown, and with it lit a fire in England that could never be undone. The coronation had been lavish. She walked pregnant among golden tapestries and music. The people watched, half in awe, half in suspicion. Even then they whispered, this queen was different. Dangerous divine, when Elizabeth was born and looked at her with pride not. Disappointment she saw in her not. Failure but fire yet the court murmured. No son no heir just a red-haired girl in a cradle too quiet for celebration as her miscarriages piled so did the tension in court the nobles grew colder. Henry grew distant Thomas Cromwell once her ally now drifted toward her downfall. Like a vulture circling a wounded lioness the charges against her were more than betrayal they were meant to humiliate adultery with common men. Incest plotting the king's death they weren't seeking justice they were writing her ruin her brother stood beside her in the trial proud. Intelligent loyal. They accused them of something unspeakable George was sentenced to die. And never wept louder than when they took him away on the scaffold and said little but the silence surrounding her said everything she had been made a villain a temptress a traitor but as she knelt she became something greater a symbol a warning a woman who had dared too much. Jane Seymour waited quietly in the wings gentle obedient everything and had refused to be. Henry saw peace in her eyes not challenge but even Jane must have wondered how does one walk into a dead queen's shoes. Anne's death was not mourned at court there were no dirges no court-wide fasting only gowns prepared for a new queen and musicians summoned to celebrate a future bought with blood. Elizabeth now motherless was declared illegitimate stripped of her title moved to a lesser household her bright eyes searched the halls for a presence that had vanished yet something inside her hardened not broken but forged years later when Elizabeth took the throne she revived the white falcon Anne's emblem not out of nostalgia but defiance. It was not a whisper of the past it was a banner unfurled in triumph. Anne's fall had taught Elizabeth something no tutor could the court was never loyal. It was a nest of knives hidden behind smiles. A queen must be adored but never possessed loved but never touched. Elizabeth devoured books she studied law languages scripture she knew her mother had died not because she was guilty but because she was powerful. Knowledge for her was armor silence was her sword some say Anne's spirit walks the tower still her head cradled in her arms searching for justice but perhaps her ghost lives not in shadow but in the light of the monarch. Her daughter became Henry rarely spoke of and after her death but those close to him noted how his eyes darkened when Elizabeth spoke her mind. The sharpness reminded him not of Catherine not of Jane of Anne and had championed reform given books in English to her ladies dared to challenge religious silence. Elizabeth too would lift England into an age of learning of language of light. The daughter carried the fire forward and reign had been short barely 3 years but she had changed the course of a nation not through armies but through courage not through sons but through a daughter a crown placed upon history unfinished but eternal. Among Anne's final possessions was a small prayer book its pages marked with trembling notes. She gave it to a lady in waiting as a keepsake. Centuries later it would surface a whisper from the scaffold's edge though silenced in life. Anne's voice echoed in Elizabeth's court. The queen quoted her mother studied her letters honored her intellect. Anna died voiceless but her daughter would never be unheard. Historians argue over what and wore to die. Some say crimson some gray but all agree she wore dignity a queen to the end crowned not with gold but with resolve. Anne's execution shocked Europe. Kings and queens whispered of England's cold betrayal but in France wherein had once learned grace some wept they remembered her as brilliant witty and Dangerously alive Thomas Cromwell the architect of her fall rose high in Henry's favor but power gained through treachery is fragile. Just 4 years later Cromwell too lost his head. The Tower forgets no blood while Anne's grave cooled Henry's wedding feast with Jane Seymour lit the hall's wine spilled, musicians played, and no one mentioned the woman buried in an arrow chest beneath cold stone. Henry gained no true peace. Jane gave him a son, but died in childbirth. His future queens brought only shadows and scandal. None matched the fire and had lit or the storm she'd unleashed. Elizabeth became a queen who would not marry. Her vow to England, her crown unshared. She had seen what marriage did to queens. She chose power over partnership, wisdom over romance, and was once called a heretic, a witch, a seductress. But through Elizabeth she became a symbol of learning, of reform, of strength. History began to shift. The villain became a vision. Elizabeth never declared an innocent she didn't need to her reign, reclaimed her mother not by words but by action, and had died disgraced. Elizabeth ruled gloriously. The child had rewritten the verdict. Courtiers often remarked that Elizabeth's eyes held something piercing. Watchful they were, her mother's eyes. Dark, alert, unreadable. They didn't just see, they judged. Henry had not spared and from death, but he had spared her the fire. Why? Some say it was guilt. Others say it was fear of how history might remember a queen burned alive. So he chose the sword, swift, clean, forgettable, and gave the executioner a purse of gold, a payment, a farewell, a final act of control. Even as her life was taken, she commanded the moment. She refused to leave the world without grace. The Tudor dynasty burned with ambition. Henry lit the flame but and added fuel. In marrying her he redefined England's soul. In killing her he tried to erase the very fire he had sparked. Mary Boleyn, once the king's lover, lived quietly. After Anne's death she faded into obscurity, her name barely mentioned, but it was Anne who had dared more and paid the ultimate price. And ladies and waiting never forgot her, even years later. In private letters and hush confessions they spoke of her laughter, her temper, her brilliance. They had seen the queen behind the mask. Elizabeth grew beneath suspicious eyes. She was watched more than loved, the daughter of a disgraced queen, a possible threat. But she watched back and remembered everything the Tower had witnessed. Centuries of death, but Anne's execution left an echo. Guard spoke of cold winds, of whispers on stone, whether ghost or guilt. Something lingered where she fell. Some believe, and wrote a letter to Henry before her death, a final plea, a confession of love or defiance. But if it existed it vanished. Perhaps it was burned, or perhaps it never needed to be read. No bells rang for Anne's death, no mourning draped the palaces, but in some hearts those quiet and hidden a silence rang louder than any chime, and that silence endured for centuries. Anne's grave lay unmarked beneath the chapel floor. Tourists walked over her, priests prayed above her. None knew the queen beneath their feet, forgotten not by time but by design. In 1876 workmen uncovered a skeleton, small, fine bed, elegant, a woman of delicate frame. The records were vague, the tombs mismatched, but those who knew the story whispered, and had been found. They gave her a name again, a proper stone, a place in history's eye. She had once been buried like a criminal. Now she lay among queens, not in shame but in silence, reclaimed. Henry never wept for, and he wore no mourning ring. He did not attend her burial. Her death was not a tragedy to him, only an inconvenience resolved. Anne's real crime was not treason, it was power she had Risen too far too fast she had dared to speak to question to influence in a world ruled by men that was unforgivable. Elizabeth learned that queens must outthink, outlast and outlive. She learned from and that a woman could wield power but only if she never let anyone hold the leash. Centuries blurred Ian's truth. Some called her a witch, others a martyr, but the myth that grew around her was always lit by the same spark, a woman who refused to kneel. Each May 19th roses appear at the tower, no trumpet sounds, no guards march, just petals on stone. Anonymous hands leave them for a queen who walked alone to her end, and trial was legal, her sentence official, but justice had not stood in the room, it had been locked outside while ambition passed the verdict and never saw Elizabeth rule, never saw the plays, the ships, the empire rise, but through Elizabeth Anne's legacy exploded like dawn, bright, sharp and unstoppable, had rewritten the verdict when Elm first smiled at Henry. She changed the course of history. It wasn't seduction, it was suggestion of something more, a woman not asking for favor but demanding recognition. Each time she carried a child and bore more than flesh, she bore a kingdom's hope, and each time she lost it, the crown on her head grew heavier, colder. They never said it aloud, but they looked at her belly more than her face. A queen was only as powerful as her womb. When it failed her, they sharpened their smiles and their knives and stood before the court, but her real trial happened within her heart. Did Henry ever love her? Did she change too much or not enough? In that moment even truth felt treacherous. George looked at, and as they were sentenced, no words, just a glance between two souls condemned not by crime but by closeness. Siblings sacrificed to the same throne. The crown and once wore sparkled with promise, but it had always been laced with poison to where it meant to bleed for it, and in the end it asked for her head. She did not cry when they led her to the scaffold. She walked with grace, each step a refusal to break in a world determined to shame her. She gave them dignity instead. The French executioner was said to be the best, and he was one swift stroke, no suffering. Anna paid him in advance, not out of fear but out of control. Even her death was her decision when her head was raised. The crowd did not cheer, no jeers, no triumph, just a strange collective silence, as if England itself had stopped breathing for a moment too long. For the rest of his reign Henry avoided her name. But when Elizabeth challenged him, outwitted his advisers, or walked too proudly, those in court said they saw and again, not in flesh but in shadow, and could have begged, could have run. But she stood, she faced the scaffold as she faced the throne, head high, heart unbowed. She died as she had lived, in defiance. Long after her death scholars found fragments of her letters, clever, fierce, loving in ink. She was alive again. Her thoughts had not faded, only waited. Elizabeth ruled not as her father had, with fear and steel, but with strategy and light. She built the world and never lived to see a golden age forged from ashes. At her coronation Elizabeth wore a gown of gold, but beneath it many believed was a heart dressed in grey and crimson, a daughter silently honoring a mother. History tried to erase, historians began to re-examine ere not as Henry's failed wife but as a political force, a reformist, a woman ahead of her time. Her voice once silenced returned in a new chorus. Elizabeth did more than rule, she revived the falcon, the very crest Henry had burned. It flew again, this time over a court that bent to a queen born of scandal and strength, and Boleyn's name, once struck from record, was carved in stone centuries later, not just on her grave but in the minds of those who saw Her not as traitor but as trailblazer. She never received justice in life but in memory she was vindicated not by trials but by triumph, not by pardon but by power returned through her child. Henry had wanted a son to secure his legacy he murdered, and for failing to give one but the daughter he scorned, built a kingdom so lasting even time paused to admire it, and Berlin was not a race. She rose again in stone, in story, in every girl who speaks when told to be silent. Her death was not the end, it was the beginning of a queen who would never leave